Okay. Money Laundering 101.
Canadian banks have been getting into a little bit of trouble when it comes to money laundering rules in Canada. So far this year, we've seen RBC hit with a fine and CIBC hit with a fine, and TD had to scrap their First Horizon acquisition, which was a purchase of a U.S. bank, and they're facing fines and issues with a U.S. regulator. These violations were reported by the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre of Canada, or FINTRAC. If you're a real estate professional, you've heard of FINTRAC, and stick around till the end of this video because I want to explain why I think all of these happenings with Canada's big six banks have some significance for real estate professionals and could be a bit of a warning sign for what's to come for the real estate industry. So on FINTRAC's website, you can see that FINTRAC recently imposed an administrative monetary penalty on the Royal Bank of Canada. This happened on December 5th, 2023, so about a week ago. And then later that week, they imposed a similar administrative monetary penalty on CIBC, the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce. In CIBC's case, they were found to have committed the following administrative violations. They failed to submit a suspicious transaction report where there were reasonable grounds to suspect that transactions were related to a money laundering or terrorist financing activity. Now, if we go to RBC's penalty, they were found to have committed 3 violations. The first was failure to submit suspicious transaction reports. The second was failure to provide information in the prescribed form and manner in suspicious transactions. While these fines are pretty tiny when you think about the market caps of the corresponding banks and the size of both of these businesses, they seem like really just a small fine or a parking ticket, or if anything, a rounding error cost of doing business for these institutions. However, the fact that these fines are taking place says more about it. So in 2022 to 2023, FINTRAC issued just 6 notices of violations to a total of $1.1 million in total for the entire year. Both of these fines are larger than their entire year's worth of fines last year. In CIBC's specific instance, they found that CIBC didn't file a suspicious transaction report even as it knew the client had been arrested and charged with criminal offenses, while the agency's review also found over 1,000 instances out of a sample of 20,000 where the information related to money transfers was incomplete. So it really makes you wonder if it's just such a low-hanging fruit here in Canada, and if money laundering is such a big part of the Canadian economy and Canadian real estate, which it seems to be regarded as globally, it would be reasonable to assume that FINTRAC could continue using these fines as a revenue driver for the government, which is definitely seeking more revenue right now, as long as they can kind of keep trickling out these nominal fines without doing too much to damage the reputations of Canadian banks. And these fines aren't the only time that Canadian banks have ended up in issues with anti-money laundering. And it makes you wonder if what happened earlier this year south of the border is what led FINTRAC to start taking it a little bit more seriously. So this headline from the Wall Street Journal says that concern over TD's anti-money laundering practices helped scuttle the First Horizon deal. So in 2022, TD Bank had decided to purchase First Horizon Bank in the U.S., according to the document obtained by S&P Global Market Intelligence through the Freedom of Information Act request. The Philadelphia Federal Reserve supervisor emailed TD's lawyer asking the company to prepare and submit a request for suspension of the processing of the transaction. And this suspension was sent on March 17th. The deal was later terminated May 4th, marking the largest U.S. bank acquisition termination ever in U.S. history, and this was from a Canadian bank. Months later, TD disclosed that it was facing a U.S. Justice Department probe regarding its Bank Secrecy Act, BSA, and anti-money laundering, AML, practices, confirming a prior report by the Wall Street Journal on May 8th that regulators were concerned about TD's AML practices. So let me know in the comments whether or not you think that this was the straw that broke the camel's back on Canadian banks' involvement in anti-money laundering, when Canadian banks wanted to go play in the U.S. sandbox and the U.S. justice system started pushing back a little bit. Do you think that FINTRAC realized that maybe Canadian banks aren't taken seriously in the U.S. banking world and wanted to start to rectify that a little bit with these fines that we're now seeing? Now, it becomes even more interesting in the backdrop of RBC receiving one of these fines when you realize that RBC has submitted a $10 billion deal for HSBC Canada and it was approved by Canada's Competition Bureau earlier this year. However, in November of this year, we saw Finance Committee MPs asking the federal government to reject the RBC-HSBC deal. Now, although it's completely unrelated, HSBC actually is known to have a pretty substantial money laundering scandal of its own. In 2012, HSBC Holdings, one of the world's largest global banks, was hit with a $1.9 billion fine, most notably serving as a conduit for Mexican drug cartels. When you think about money laundering, it almost makes you think about these badass characters in TV shows like Walter White from Breaking Bad or Marty Byrde from Ozarks, who gives this really cool clinic on how to launder money to his teenage son.
Okay. Money laundering 101. Say you come across a suitcase with $5 million in it. Better get that money into the banking system. But here's the problem. That dirty money, it's too clean. Looks like it just came out of a bank vault. You mix the $5 million with the cash from a joyful business. That mixture goes from an American bank to a bank from any country that doesn't have to listen to the IRS.
And this isn't the first time that Canadian banks have been roped into controversy regarding global organized crime. There was a recent video of a professional money launderer on TikTok who named a Canadian bank as one of the best places in the world to launder money through.
Trying to hide the money. What banks are best?
Like the names? You know the names?
Sure. Yeah.
So the one that I know that was used a lot.
Canadian Bank.
Yeah.
And that,
So-
why is
excuse
that the
me.
best? They just
They're the most
asked
corrupt,
Wow.
which is crazy to say, but it's the truth. I'll tell you something interesting that I heard. I can't tell you that this is factual, but I heard it from someone that is involved in banks. They told me a couple of years ago, Global Bank does this survey every year of how many companies are like red flagged for money laundering and stuff like that. And a couple of years ago, when I was in what I was doing, Canada was number 1. You guys were number 2. So that shocked me.
Wow.
So this guy told me, he's like, number 1 was Canada. Like US was like almost half the amount of companies. 100%.
A lot of times it's legitimate companies that don't want to pay taxes.
A lot of guys that did that. Not even illegitimate, no
Right.
criminal intentions. I want to save some money on taxes.
Yeah.
And we've seen multiple reports from the real estate industry about real estate being used to launder money in Canada. This comes from the Ontario Real Estate Association, says that money laundering is a significant problem in Ontario real estate transactions. And according to the head of the Ontario Real Estate Association, the province's housing market is rife with dirty money. About $30 billion worth of ill-gotten gains has been laundered through Ontario real estate transactions over a 10-year period, according to a money laundering inquiry by the British Columbia government. And this inquiry that's being called into question here is called the Cullen Commission, which was a commission of inquiry into money laundering in British Columbia. And it found that there were billions and billions of dollars being laundered through Canadian real estate. So when I look at real estate's role in money laundering, when I look at Canada's role as almost a global financial hub for money laundering activity, and when I see FINTRAC cracking down on big institutions in Canada in the pursuit of a greater degree of legitimacy when it comes to anti-money laundering concerns, it really begs the question, what should the real estate industry expect when it comes to FINTRAC and anti-money laundering? So I've always felt that it was kind of strange that real estate agents were the last line of defense for filling out these FINTRAC forms. And I don't say that disrespectfully to the real estate industry, but it does seem like a relatively informal role in the transaction when you have banks and lawyers who are also in the supply chain of somebody buying and selling real estate. So real estate professionals have to fill out something called an individual identification record or a FINTRAC form. And these are basically just taken, not really referenced. They also have to do a receipt of funds record, similar to what banks would have to do for these large transactions and for deposits received on real estate. And they also have to do a search for politically exposed persons and heads of international organizations, which requires people to pull from a database. And this is a requirement under the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act, and executed by FINTRAC. Do you think that the real estate industry is the low-hanging fruit or next on deck if the Canadian government is trying to generate revenue through these FINTRAC fines, and real estate professionals should be concerned that they're next in the line of institutions that the government might be going after to start cracking down on money laundering. So the Cullen Commission was appointed in May 2019 to lead an inquiry following 3 reports stating that hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal cash affected the province's luxury vehicle, gaming, and real estate industries. The money laundered also affected foreign citizens from purchasing a property in Vancouver. As a result of affecting property purchasers, housing prices and living costs were significantly higher than the local population's budget. In Canada, it was stated that a report that owners of about half of the city's most expensive homes are purchased using secretly structured purchasing methods. This situation not only affects Canada, but also affects China negatively. So one of the things that I find really interesting here, and this brings me back to regulations that we're seeing in the Canadian real estate industry. So firstly, when you have entities that are buying real estate for reasons other than making money, like they're not even rational investors. So when you hear about speculation or you hear about investment and these things are causing problems for housing affordability in Canada, now you have a whole different category of people who actually don't even really care to make money in Canadian real estate. They're completely irrational consumers. They don't care if it goes up in value. They don't care if it earns a yield. They don't care if it loses them money, as long as it's a capable vehicle for converting cash into currency on the books, as long as the asset is capable of laundering money for them. And I find it really interesting because one of the things suggested in this Cullen Commission is that we need a beneficial ownership registry in Canada to understand who owns these properties and who's benefiting from the capital within them. And we don't even have that in Canada. So we're literally just throwing policy at a problem that we don't even really know what it is. Or we're basically throwing policy at a symptom rather than the core problem, because we can't acknowledge the core problem because we don't even know who owns these properties. So earlier this year, in March, the Government of Canada tabled a new legislation to create a beneficial ownership registry. And in November of this year, they passed the law to create the Public Beneficial Ownership Register. And the first order of business in order to actually build that beneficial ownership registry was to try and impose this underused housing tax, which now has been extended until April 30th of 2024. And this is where I think you really run into the challenge, and where you think about how small these fines are for an RBC or a CIBC, where they're being hit with fines of $5.5 million or $1.5 million. And that's basically like a parking ticket or a small cost of doing business. I think when you look at some of these money launderers in Canada, they see this underused housing tax and they see this fine that they get if they fail to register for the underused housing tax and pay the tax. They're hit with a fine of $5,000 or $10,000 depending on if they're an individual or a business. And this part fascinates me because I look at that scale of RBC and CIBC, and then I look at the potential scale of people who are money laundering through Canadian real estate, and I think they would probably interpret this almost the exact same way. A $5,000 or $10,000 fine for a corporation is a small privacy tax for people who want to keep their money tied up in Canadian real estate. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the matter. I know I've covered a lot, from FINTRAC fining Canadian banks to the same FINTRAC playing a role in the real estate transaction in the way that realtors collect data from their clients, and my thoughts around whether or not real estate will be next on the list for this government agency to start using it as a revenue generating tool. I also shared my thoughts on what potentially brought on the government taking this a little bit more seriously, more specifically the failed acquisition of First Horizon Bank from TD's Bank, and U.S. regulators starting to poke around in Canadian banks' anti-money laundering systems. And then finally, I discussed the impact of money laundering in Canadian real estate and housing affordability, and how I see the government starting to try and crack down on it by building a beneficial ownership registry and creating this underused housing tax as a vehicle to try and get people to register for that. It really makes me wonder whether or not it's all in vain. It makes me wonder whether or not they'll be successful in cracking down on this. I think it's going to take decades of work to unwind the willful blindness as it's outlined in Sam Cooper's book, which I highly recommend you check out, by the way. And the only other thing I would mention here that I think a lot of people dismiss is And it is mentioned in that summary of the Cullen Commission that I read, as you get stronger governments like China playing a more authoritative role in the global economy, I wouldn't dismiss the impact of China wanting to know who these beneficial owners are of Canadian real estate if they are laundering illicit funds generated from or hidden from the Chinese economy. Thanks a lot for listening to what I had to say today. I really appreciate your time, and I would appreciate it even more if you could hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and leave me a comment below. I'd love to have a discussion with you about what you think about this and whether or not you think that this is a solvable problem for the Canadian government and the Canadian economy. Thanks a lot, and I will see you next week.